Next group of algae we want to discuss are the complex multicellular algae in Long Island Sound and the ocean around us, with all of the marine algae growing on the rocks in front of me, is a perfect place to discuss this. Most of the multicellular saltwater algae are members of brown algae. Now, the brown simply refers to the dominant, the color of the dominant non-photosynthetic pigment. In this case, obviously, it's a brown pigment. But there are other multicellular types of algae other than the browns. Most of those belong to either the green algae group or the red algae group. But we'll concentrate our discussion primarily on the brown algae. Along the northeast coast, and certainly in Long Island Sound around me, one of the most common types of brown algae belongs to the genus Fucus. As you can see right at my feet, here's a Fucus plant that I just pulled off the rock. In fact, we'll talk about what held it on the rock in a moment. If you look at this plant, you'll see that it has leaf-like structures called blades. These are their photosynthetic organs. There are short stem-like structures that are called stipes. And right at the very base of the plant, what was holding that onto the rock are root-like structures called holdfasts. It's a very functional name. It holds the algae fast to the rock. You'll notice I didn't use the terms leaf, stem, and root. That's because, as we'll see in subsequent lectures, that these terms are confined or used only for the higher plants that are vascular, that have tissues that call xylem and phloem that we'll talk about later. So these are root-like, stem-like, and leaf-like parts. Another group of brown algae that are very dominant on the oceans in this planet are a whole collection called kelp. These are algae that most people just simply refer to as seaweed. You see big, huge strands of this brown algae washing up on the beach. Kelp grows, as I mentioned, throughout the oceans, especially in warmer water areas. There are huge beds of kelp all around the band of the equator around the world. In some areas, it creates huge forests of vegetation. Kelp can grow up to 150 feet in length. Very, very long stipes, huge blades, often 25 or 30 feet long. That is, those leaf-like photosynthetic organs floating and undulating on the surface of the ocean. One of the areas that you find kelp in huge abundance is in an area called the Sargasso Sea. And in fact, the dominant kelp in that area belongs to the genus Sargassum, named after the sea, or vice versa. Now, the Sargasso Sea is a fairly renowned area for a couple of reasons. The Sargasso Sea is right in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. As you know, that area where many ships and planes have disappeared, and the stuff of which legends and myths are built. This is a sea that's becalmed because of winds and currents that die in this huge Sargasso Sea area. It's also renowned because all of the American eels in North America, on the east coast of North America, go to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. That is, all of the eels from the Hudson and the Susquehanna and the Delaware River, all of them go on an annual migration to the Sargasso Sea, spawn, millions of them spawning, and the young swim back to the rivers along the northeast coast. Now, there's another group of algae that I want to discuss that aren't complex marine multicellular forms. They are saltwater forms, but they're single-celled microscopic organisms. This is a group of algae called the dinoflagellates. Now, the dinoflagellates are part of the phytoplankton population that we've already previously discussed. These dinoflagellates, though, on occasion undergo huge blooms, that is, population explosions. This has been exacerbated, that there have always been blooms, but they've been exacerbated by the dumping of sewage, farm fertilizer, lawn and garden fertilizer into our rivers, all of these nutrients being dumped into the bays and along the coastline in the continental shelf area. Well, what this has caused is a tremendous enrichment of these dinoflagellates so that now these blooms are massive. They're huge blooms called tides. There are two types, red tides and brown tides. Now again, this deals with the basic pigment of the dinoflagellate. In Long Island Sound, as I mentioned, where we are today, the brown tides are what are dominant. And at times, those tides, those blooms are so massive that they block out light and cause suffocation of all the other plant types, and a lot of fish, shellfish, that is mollusks, crustaceans die because of it. Now, these tides also, many of them are toxic, especially the red tides. Now, the red tides are found further south, very heavily along the southern Atlantic coast, the east coast of Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico. And as I mentioned, many of these tides are toxic, so that when the dinoflagellates die en masse, as they will, they have a very short lifespan, they release toxin into the water. Now, this toxin is often very lethal to aquatic organisms, especially fish, and very often huge fish kills result from the toxin. We, as humans consuming fish, and especially crustaceans and mollusks, have to be very careful, because things such as clams and oysters and mussels bioaccumulate that toxin, so that when we eat them, we're eating huge amounts of this toxin released by the dinoflagellates. And as I mentioned, it can make us very sick, and there have been many cases of people dying from the toxin associated with these tides. Another unusual thing about the dinoflagellates is that many of them are bioluminescent. Now, that's a big term, but simply means they have a chemical called phosphorus that emits light. Phosphorus is the key to this. And at night, on a calm ocean, when there are huge masses of these dinoflagellates near the surface, it creates an eerie glow over the entire surface of the ocean. I've seen it when I've been out fishing 50 miles off the coast, and it is rather spectacular and very strange. Now, it's not unusual for these lower organisms, or lower organisms in general, to be bioluminescent. It's fairly common in Monera and fungi, as well as in Kingdom Protista.